Loki, the new big character that has been introduced as a powerhouse for the world of One Piece, is more than likely going to die at the end of Elbaf. But not only is this exceedingly powerful character going to die, it's more than likely that his powers are going to get looted and passed on to some very important members of the Straw Hat crew. Ranging from mystic weapons to possible devil fruits, these are abilities that are going to completely shift the way the Straw Hats operate and shift everything going into the final war. And if you like vids like this, go ahead and subscribe and like the video, because I got plenty more for you. So it's been made quite clear that in the more recent chapters of Elbaf, Oda is really pitching the idea that Loki is going to be an absolute powerhouse in the One Piece universe. And while that may have been made somewhat obvious by the way everybody talks about him, Loki's extreme height now, combined with the massive hammer that he wields and his potential devil fruit, let's say, is going to be very much a key factor in all of this evaluation. And those objects need to be a bit more explained for you to really understand how important it is that the Straw Hats will end up with them. So let's break them down individually. I'm obviously not going to really touch on the factors of physical nature, because there's no way any of the Straw Hats are getting Loki's immense size or strength, even though that would be fantastic. But there is, of course, a strong possibility that one of them could end up with his weapon. Now, the principle of this is that Ragnar is a massive hammer, and while that may in principle seem better for a giant than almost anybody else, there's probably a few caveats involved with that. This weapon seems to be treated of a high caliber quality, similar to Zoro's swords or other great weapons within the world of One Piece. The fact that it alone actually has a name is a good indication of this. The weapon also seems to be capable of using massive amounts of power to deliver great blows, which of course a hammer should be able to do, and it is assisted by the size of its user. Now, a lot of people would argue that right away the size of the user what makes this dangerous, but that's not inherently true, and if it is a great weapon, there is a long-standing theory that great weapons can actually change their size in One Piece. The greatest example of this is more than likely the way that Enma doesn't really stay at the same size that it is when it's with Odin. Odin is like 9 feet tall, and the sword is like up to his chest when it's laid out flat. Otherwise, with Zoro, it would be actually taller than he is. Yet with Zoro, it is perfectly balanced and scaled, so it seems more than likely these weapons can change their shape and size, similar to magic weapons in other media. That having been said, if this weapon were to shrink down, I'm sure it would still be quite substantial in size, even for a human user. This is to say nothing of the fact that there is a substantial theory that Loki's hammer actually has a devil fruit of its own, which might very well be possible. It could be a contributing factor to why Loki was so powerful to try and be in the first place, requiring Shanks to actually intervene. And to be honest, up to this point in time, we've seen characters that either have a devil fruit within themselves or within their weapons, never one who had both, and it would be a contributing factor as to why Loki might be so strong. The other and more obvious elephant in the room with this is that Loki himself obviously possesses a devil fruit, and more than likely this is the Storm God fruit. Obviously, the one defining characteristic of it that we have at this point is that that fruit can actually seem to be summoning lightning and being infused within the hammer itself. And while this is especially bad for Elbaf on its own, because, you know, lightning, fire, tree doesn't blend very well, it also perhaps ties into a very interesting question that people have had since Loki was initially introduced. Why does he think that he is Nika? This has always been kind of a weird question, because a lot of people have assumed that he had a god fruit of some type and that it was some kind of coincidence, and honestly that seems the most likely here. All of the god fruits are said to be able to acquire different elements of the various fruits. Obviously Paramecia and Zone are the most common, and obviously there might even be a little bit of room for Logia in there. I mean, Luffy seems to control some aspects of fire with his fruit, though that hasn't been fully explained yet, and it seems that in that same junction, Loki's fruit is actually seeming to be teed up to be able to control all natural elements, at least in regards to weather, though the only definitive one that we have right now is actually lightning. Loki might also very well have some other unique abilities that we have not seen yet, such as perhaps a special fighting form that uses both of these. I'm not really so much worried about that right now, because whoever ends up with these weapons and powers more than likely won't be able to adapt that in the same way. Speaking of which, this gives us a very good juncture to bring up who's more than likely going to get which of these abilities. And yeah, it must be said that while not every Straw Hat gets an upgrade in each arc, obviously some are really more set up for these kinds of developments than others. Wano was very heavily keyed to be an arc tied for Zoro, and he ended up with Enma as well as unlocking Conqueror's Haki. Whole Cake Island was obviously tilted in direction for Sanji, and he obviously developed even more with his Germa upgrades that he got, and so on and so forth. You can really use any of these examples, so we're going to apply them to a couple characters that are in desperate need of an upgrade right now, and that is number one, Usopp. I feel as though it's fair to say that Usopp has been really teed up for Elbaf. I mean, he had the second strongest connection to the Giants, really tied with Luffy all the way back on Little Garden. He basically idolizes the Giants to a point that he views them as the ultimate embodiment of what his dream to be a brave warrior of the sea is. And obviously we've been keying up for a while that he was supposed to get some kind of upgrade. I mean, even just in confidence would be a key aspect of this, but more than likely that'll come at the extension of him gaining access to a weapon that would give him that confidence. And in this case, I think it will be Ragnar. Loki's hammer actually ties into a very common and old joke for One Piece, which is that Usopp has a move and a weapon called Usopp Hammer, and while it is a very funny sight gag, it has also always stood out as being his only close-range weapon. If we blend this with the idea and the assumption that Ragnar is in fact one of these special grade weapons, either for the use of a devil fruit or of its own manufacturing, it seems highly likely that this weapon is destined to end up with Usopp, especially if you take into account that Ragnar is clearly based on Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. Now, for people who have only seen Marvel, there's probably a bit of confusion here, but basically, depending on which version you're looking at, in Marvel, Mjolnir is basically said to be wielded by those who are worthy, brave, true, strong, kind, that kind of thing, but also have the ability to take life. That is a defining factor of Mjolnir, by the way, not an optional one. At the same time, in the classic Norse legends, the idea of Mjolnir is tied less to a Excalibur-like desire to be good and more merely the ability to wield it. Literally being able to pick up Thor's hammer is an indication of how strong you really are. Both of these fit very well for Usopp's character. It being locked into the weapon having to like you in some key and critical way is obviously a big part of his character gaining a ton of confidence. But if Usopp will end up with the hammer, then who's going to end up with Loki's devil fruit? And honestly, at this point, that should be kind of obvious because it's going to be Nami. I have always said that the cowardly trio will end up with the god fruits by the end of the series. That is a key and critical factor for all of them. But with the fact that Loki apparently has this fruit here a bit earlier than I genuinely thought it was going to pop up, it seems more than likely that it will end up with Nami here. And there is a practical side to this. Obviously, this fruit most blends well with Nami. Her Weather knowledge would take it to an extreme that would make it so dangerous. It would literally be comparable to a person like Enel who can so apply their devil fruit that it just transcends whatever limitations you think it should have. But there's two other aspects of this that really bring this fruit home, and especially is the one that I think is going to end up with the series. One is that Oda has actually gone on record in Q&A stating that if Nami were to end up with Enel's fruit, she would actually have developed into a lightning woman with peerless confidence. He actually even said she would gain fame, wealth, and so much power and ability that she would be feared by all, and the only person that could stand up to her would be Luffy, which actually would be very funny, given how the relationship normally works. Now, honestly, despite the fact god fruits aren't Logia fruits and you can still take physical damage, I can see her developing this kind of personality with access to this fruit. It is a god fruit, and to be honest, I think being around Nika will probably stimulate some things in this fruit regardless. We also have the tie-in factor here that we know that in the second era, the storm god, who weirdly is referred to as the sea god, was never able to make contact with Nika in this generation and was very angry as a result of it, seeming to give off great despair or displeasure at this. And honestly, that could kind of tie into the close relationship that Nami has with Luffy and the way that she cried when she thought he had died on Wano. These last two elements basically pave the way for the third element, which is that honestly, there's been a lot of debate right now as to who the shield and spear are for Luffy, as this is a common and reoccurring iconography for Nika, and most people assume that it also applies to Luffy. There has been plenty of excellent theory crafting done on the idea that Zoro is the shield, as there's a lot to do with like the Elbaf shield appearing in chapter 1111, 1111 being Zoro's birthday, and it is also a key and critical aspect for like his power system somewhat being based on like Buddhism and other esoteric belief systems in addition to that rely on these kinds of numbers. It has also left some contention as to who people think the spear is, and while some people will jump to the conclusion that it is Sanji, really isn't. At least I don't think it was set up to be in the beginning. Instead, it seems much more likely that the spear is the second person that was acquired, and that is Nami. This is doubled down on by the fact that Oda has said that Nami is always one of the three critical characters that begins each saga alongside Zoro and Luffy. If she were to gain access to this fruit, she could finally take her rightful place alongside those two as the spearhead of the Straw Hats. And yeah, this does mean that Sanji would yet again get bumped down in order of the ship, but let's be honest, he's the ship's cook. He doesn't actually care about being the strongest fighter on the crew. If you ended up liking this video, please subscribe to the channel and go ahead and like the video. I've got plenty of other content for you to check out, including this video here about how Enel is the first Lunarian, or about this one, how some people misunderstand Luffy's entire premise within the series.